a cloud, having fun today in the great white outdoors. The Brollys.
Rainbows climb, clouds drift by, Brollys fly through a magic sky. Is it real? Are they dreams? Nothing appears to be what it seems. Then far away I can hear a voice in the weather house call out a name. Mr. Brolly, it's time for the rain.
Harry was trying to go to sleep, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than he opened them again. Tucked up beside Harry in bed were his toys, Elephant and Hippo. Snake, as always, lay on the rug by the door, and Bird was perched on the chest of drawers. Harry stared down at his patchwork quilt. It was different from other quilts. Instead of flowery scraps of material, it was made of little embroidered pictures of rainbows, stars and planets, clouds, and great flashes of lightning in a dark and stormy sky. It had been made a long, long time ago. On the wall hung Harry's weather house. If the day was going to be fine and sunny, Mrs. Brolly came to her door. If the day was going to be wet and cloudy, Mr. Brolly came out. But of course, they never came out together, for it is impossible for a day to be both wet and dry at the same time. But what would happen if they both came out together? Wondered Harry, and he sat up and stared at the weather house. As he stared, the doors seemed to grow larger. His bed grew smaller, and he found himself at the entrance of the weather house. A light was shining from the door, through which Harry could see Mr. Brolly no longer fixed to his wooden stand, but moving freely about the room. Harry was standing by the window in the weather house. Mrs. Brolly was close by, stitching new patches onto her quilt. On each new patch was the picture of a snowflake. Outside, snow was drifting gently down. "Brolly makes them, my dear," said Mrs. Brolly. "And would you believe it? He makes each one different from all the others. I say to him, 'Brolly, why do you bother? There's few that know, and few would care.' But he says, 'Mrs. B, I am an artist, and an artist must create.'" She sounded very proud of Mr. Brolly. But when Harry turned back to the window, each drifting flake looked just like another. Harry began to yawn. "Why don't you go on an expedition?" said Mrs. Brolly. "All small boys should go on an expedition." It was a wonderful idea, thought Harry. "I could go to the North Pole," he said. "Indeed you could," said Mrs. Brolly, and reaching into her bag, she brought out a compass. "This will help you find your way," she said. From the back door of the weather house, Harry looked out. The snowflakes were falling faster than ever. The little cloud had come from Mrs. Brolly's bag, and he came up behind Harry and butted him gently. "Bly, bly," he said. "Aren't you coming with me?" said Harry. But the little cloud just drifted quickly to where Mrs. Brolly sat. "Oh," it said. Harry went out into the garden, and as he stepped onto the path, a beautiful red sled appeared. Tied to the sled were a number of bundles. Taking hold of the rope which was tied to the sled, Harry set off on his great adventure. Halfway down the path, he stopped and turned and looked back at the weather house. It looked warm and safe and comforting. Mrs. Brolly was still sitting and stitching, and the little cloud was hovering over her knee. "Now you be careful, my dear," he heard Mrs. Brolly say. "Don't you go raining on my quilt." For a moment, Harry wanted to turn and run back. Then he thought of how exciting it was to be going on an expedition, and of how brave everyone would think he had been. Grasping the rope tightly, he went down the garden path. But as he went, he saw that everything was covered with thick snow, so that he couldn't tell which was the bush which bore the red berries in autumn, or which was the tree where Little Bird liked to sing in the sun. Then he came to a part of the garden where nothing but snow lay before him. There was not one footprint to be seen, not one paw print, or the print of a bird's foot. Harry would be the first to make his mark. In the weather house, Mr. Brolly came hurrying into the kitchen, smiling happily. "My dear," he said, "I've made flurries of snow. I've made drifts of snow. I've made—" Then he stopped and looked around. "Where's the boy?" he said. "I've sent him on an expedition," said Mrs. Brolly. "He's gone to the North Pole." "An expedition!" cried Mr. Brolly. "To the North Pole! But he's just a small boy." "All small boys should go on an expedition," said Mrs. Brolly. "Sometimes I think you are too hard, Mrs. B," said Mr. Brolly, as he strode from the room, leaving Wilkins quivering with fear at the thought of his friend Harry alone in the snow. In the control room, Mr. Brolly pressed the smiley button on the computer. "Hello," said the computer, "and what can I do for you today?" "I want to see what's happening to Harry," said Mr. Brolly. The computer sighed. It's very boring," it said. "He's just plodding along in the snow." "I want to see Harry," said Mr. Brolly. "Oh, very well," said the computer. "See? There's nothing at all to worry about." But even as it spoke, Harry stepped into a snowdrift and completely disappeared. "Whoops," said the computer. "Oh, the brave little chap!" cried Mr. Brolly. The little cloud had floated into the room and was hovering over his left shoulder and staring intently at the computer screen. "Do something to help him," cried Mr. Brolly. "Oh, very well," said the computer.